This is the 7th cycle that we're running of Urban Arc. This is kind of a very special week for us, because we find friends and colleagues from all over the world. It's been sort of online for the last couple of cycles because of COVID. But as things come back, I mean, as an institution, IIHS has been teaching right through. We were kind of one of those insane institutions that sort of tried to hold on to the fact that you could actually teach face-to-face. It was complex and we had to manage a bubble here. But over the last many months just now, we have been pretty active and, doing tough stuff face-to-face. And at least in our experience, and certainly in my own personal experience, the ability of bringing people together face-to-face, to have conversations, to actually engage on questions, even though they may agree or disagree, is really the important part of what sort of academic life is about the new kinds of researches that we're engaged with, etc. So this year, we've picked an interesting theme, and I think we've got an absolutely stunning response. As many of some of our colleagues were discussing just now, over this week, we start this week with our PhD workshop. We had a lot of very interesting people here. Many of you joined us. And over the next 2 or 3 days, I think we will have maybe 1,000+ people, both online and in person, kind of joining us. So there's a wonderful opportunity for conversation. Of course, we've had to limit access at the moment because, as you know, there are some concerns. There is a big wave building in some parts of the world, especially from China. And we didn't want to necessarily, for this week at least, I don't know how the rest of the month is going to go through all the processes of testing and stuff like that. So we would have really looked forward to have welcomed a lot more of you here in person, but we've tried to limit it a little bit because, there are things happening in the world again. And we just had a team here last week, which had come from many places, and everybody was tested because of all of the challenges coming through. And, India's just placed restrictions on international travel from certain places, etc. Anyway, so back to the theme of the conference. In some senses, some of us would hope that this is the end of a really bad few years, fine? It happens every 100 years. It was pretty nasty. A hell of a lot of people died, and we are opening the session in some senses as sort of both a reminder and celebration of the lives of a whole lot of people who passed, both in this country. This country probably had the largest number of casualties in the world. It saw some of the most significant suffering. If those of us remember what happened 2 years ago, when millions of people were forced to walk back to their homes, a whole range of crises played themselves out. People have gone back to places where they're not able to come back from. Some deep structural changes have taken place. Poverty has deepened, inequality has certainly deepened, etc. So, we would have hoped that is over. But in actual fact, when we look at the sort of global system of cities, or even ours, there are still some deep challenges. In fact, in some ways, those of us who work a little bit in economics may say that we're at the beginning of a trough of a quantitative sort of cycle in some senses, fine? We don't really know that because a lot of this is prospective, but there's a serious set of challenges that are coming together simultaneously. Some of them are geopolitical, and we can see the implication. A conflict in a relatively small part of the world has actually consumed many countries and certainly many cities. If you track food prices and look at sort of political stability in different parts of the world, we've known that for about 150 years or more, and that is that volatility in food prices is a recipe for political change, in some cases regime change. And we've seen that happening in some places, and I think Sri Lanka's the most dramatic example. In our neighborhood, but in many parts of Africa, similar things are actually happening. So there's serious geopolitical questions that are emerging. In a sense, we may be experiencing a reset to 89, 90, which means, the idea that the world is flat at one end, and the idea of this kind of peace dividend that we saw at the end of the last Cold War may potentially be over. We don't know that as yet, and in some senses, those of us who are working with people who are poor and marginal and will become increasingly poor and marginal if the conflict builds up are really hoping this is not true. But the fact is that those processes are in motion, and they're in motion at scale. So I think that's something that we have to sort of really consider in some senses. So even though there is this kind of narrative about cities being important and, urban systems actually taking the forefront of a lot of processes. And we've seen that in COVID. I mean, across the world in COVID, I would say the most significant and most systematic responses that we've seen have actually been from local and regional governments. National governments have faltered, and, probably one of the largest governments in the world, surprisingly, after having done lots of dramatic things over the last couple of years, is really struggling just now in the middle of, the Lunar New Year kind of movement that's there, which in a sense kicked off the process. So there are some things that we don't necessarily understand. We sort of behave as if we do, and we have control over them. But in actual practice, that's not necessarily true. So one has to kind of, I think, be fairly honest and straightforward on this, and essentially say that there are many things in flux. Of course, the city is always in flux in some senses, or urban systems are always in flux. But maybe the flux that we're going through just now is fairly significant and may determine over the next 20 or 30 years how things will be. And in that sense, I think what we're trying to do in the session that we have today, and we have a really rich fare for you. Pretty much every system we're talking about, we're trying to touch on. Obviously, the biophysical system is in flux. We know that. I mean, at IIHS, we work very extensively on those questions, on questions of climate, on questions of biodiversity. So even though we made some progress in the last few years, things are at a dramatic low in some ways. We know that we're well past the limits as far as climate is concerned. We are entering a world in which we may well see the beginnings of a 1.5 overshoot. We know that at 1.1 degrees where we are just now, there are huge impacts in every system of the world, especially in urban systems. As we go forward, and we sort of, unfortunately, will hit 1.5 possibly in the next decade or more. We also have a big challenge because COVID has set back within coach development in some parts of the world by, I would say, by a decade or more. And these are not necessarily the most unequal part of the world like Brazil, etc. I mean, of course, Brazil has had a terrible time during COVID, or even the United States, which is in trouble, or the UK, which in some ways has now sort of firmly placed itself on the pathway of becoming a developing country. So I mean, these are structural shifts that are actually happening in many parts of the world. So development is in trouble. It has been in trouble because of the ongoing debate. Many of the scholars on this question are in this room or sort of online. The debate about modernity and development. But even if you take the objective UN view of things, sustainable development is in deep trouble. So the idea of this sort of consensus that was built in 2013, 14, 15, that there would be no one who's left behind, there's no place that's left behind, that we would have all of these nice things to happen in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of hunger, etc. And most important in our context, poverty, that is in deep trouble. And it's not only in trouble because of COVID. I think COVID has sort of exacerbated those questions. We can see the fault lines across the world. COVID, in a sense, has exposed, those tectonic fault lines that are there. And inequality, which is, I think, a very important theme of the work of many people in this in the conference and in this country, has really come to the forefront. So when we're talking about cities in flux, my own sense is we cannot talk about cities in flux without addressing some of the really core challenges that urban systems have neither sort of dealt with, nor in some senses been successful in engaging with for a long period of time. And inequality is one of them. One could sort of make the hypothesis that in some senses, a lot of what we see in cities today across the world is driven by the fundamental fact that they're based on inequality, in some senses, yeah? You could make that argument. Inequality between sort of the sort of set up transition from rural to urban areas, that's one part of the story, but within the city itself. The deep inequality is what drives certain forms of development, that what drives certain forms of productivity in some senses, and the whole debate that we've had for many years on the economies of scale and scope, which have driven the idea of global cities and all of these kind of things that are there. So I think a much sharper engagement with inequality as it exists and it plays itself out in all domains, in the biophysical, in the built environment, and we have again some of the best scholars in the world who are looking at this question, dealing with spatial inequality and the built environment, whether it's in housing or the use of open spaces, which you'll hear about here, or the processes of planning in some senses, which help exacerbate or strengthen things. And we know that from experiences in many parts of the world, including South Africa, for example, or even Brazil, and potentially in India. One of the questions we have is how far is Indian planning that different from apartheid planning in some senses, accepting, we're governed by a different set of rules. So the structural inequalities that are built into our system have to be examined quite carefully, because in the Anthropocene, there are limited things that you can actually do to make things possible. So because the biophysical is really pushed at the current point of time, the pushback that you're going to get from whatever natural systems is so significant that the wiggle room that you have is actually quite limited. And it's not only about climate. I mean, last week we had the Global Commission for the Economics of Water here in this room, and one of the core things that we're struggling with at the moment is the fact that at the moment about 70 to 100 million people, many of them in urban areas, largely in Africa, experience serious food insecurity, hunger, and almost famine. And we know those areas. But the fact is that by 2050, that number may rise to about 500 to 600 million. And this is not some doom and gloom kind of process. These are some of the most significant kind of scholars in the space. And the thing is, and the reason is very simple. We're running out of water across the world. We've basically abstracted so much water. And it's not only a question of urban systems, which are now going to experience much more drought and flooding. This city got into the news last year because some people's houses were flooded. And of course, this has been going on in many places. But the fact is, the biophysical limits are actually going to pose significant challenges. And then, of course, there are these significant shifts that are taking place in terms of governance and political processes, including in this country and otherwise. Many of them have an urban root, but I don't think there's been adequate scholarship or engagement on how they play out with a whole range of other processes, economic processes fundamentally, and social processes. So in that sense, I think this theme is really interesting. And as we go through land, real estate, planning systems, infrastructure, questions of gender inequality over the next 3 days, I think we'll be touching on many of these elements. And for us, this is a special sort of time of the year, because this is how we try and privilege, in some senses, younger scholars, specifically from this part of the world, but again across the world. Because in many ways, scholarship is important and interesting, but there are very few places that privilege or create the opportunity for younger scholars to engage, to actually sort of experience what it is to deal with some of the best minds and practitioners on the planet and sort of engage on that. So even though next year, hopefully, we can do this with much larger numbers, I think this is the opportunity that we try and provide over the last many years to bring people together, get them to think critically, to get them to think openly in a world in which thinking and speaking openly is not often practiced. Fine? We try to create the safe space where people can be critical, where they can be propositive, and they can challenge each other to try and look at, in a sense, both framing sort of the problematic and also looking forward to kind of solutions. So I'm really glad that, you're able to join us in this. It's going to be an exciting 3 days, and, eventually it'll lead to proceedings, and we're very glad to have with us a colleague from Urban Studies. So that's a great privilege to have you here, and we're really happy that this kind of conversation is happening and that you brought Professor Robinson from long ways away to India. And we hope this kind of engagement can actually happen, because at IIHS, in some senses, we are privileged because we work with 100 plus universities across the world. The last 3 or 4 years have been very exciting, literally working across all 6 continents in some senses, comparative work on very interesting cities from Beijing to Medellin to Cape Town and our own here. But for those of you who don't know it, we actually work with about 1,000 towns and cities in this country. So there's an increasing depth of engagement here on real practical questions, and we're working with a whole range of issues. And that, in a sense, provides us a very fertile ground for sort of examining some of the things that we talk about here. And I think that's the opportunity. There's so much of opportunity, both in this country and otherwise, to engage with real questions on the ground. And I think the beauty of remarkable theory is it allows you to take something out of epistemic or other context and move into other places. And I think that comparative element is really what we're very happy about. So, urban studies has kind of enabled a whole sort of ethos of engagement in this question. And we're very glad that we're able to have you across here for these few days. So I'll stop there, and then, all the best. And it's going to be fun to see how we manage so many hundreds of people online. That I think is a new experience that we've had for other things. I mean, we have a film festival, we have a writings festival, but to do that in a conference, well, all power to you to manage it.
Well, we see. Hopefully, 2 years have taught us how to go hybrid. We'll break for tea and coffee outside and come back in about 20 minutes to start our first panel. So we start the panel at 10 o'clock. Could I request presenters to come here 10 minutes before we start? Thank you. Thanks, Aaron.